Flames tore through the barn in the dead of night, swallowing horses alive. Their screams ripped across the Montana Valley. A lone figure charged straight into the inferno without hesitation. The door had been latched from the outside, 11 years later. Dust billowed as the stagecoach rolled to a stop on Main Street. The door swung open. A towering woman stepped down, unfolding to her full height, head and shoulders above every man in the silent crowd. Silver Creek froze. The air thickened with tension. Eyes that once lingered on a ruined face now fixed on her enormous frame. Whispers spread like cold wind through the pines. The blacksmith stood rigid at the edge of the street, gripping his hat brim until his knuckles went white, bracing for the familiar recoil of horror. She did not look away. She met his eyes. She crossed the dusty road toward him. She extended her strong, steady hand. The whole town stood motionless, holding its breath for whatever was about to explode. Garrett Vance did not look in mirrors. Not anymore. Not since the summer of 1876, when the Delacroix barn went up in flames so fast, the whole valley thought God himself had struck a match. 11 years now. 11 winters of frost on the window and 11 summers of dust on the road. And still he woke every morning and shaved by touch, not by sight. Touch because sight was the enemy. Because the left side of his face was the boy he used to be. Smooth, sun-browned, the face that once made the girls giggle behind their fans at the Sunday social, and the right side. The right side was something else entirely, a ridge of pale scar tissue that ran from his jaw to his temple, pulling the corner of his eye down just slightly, just enough that strangers looked twice. Looked away. Looked back again when they thought he wasn't watching. He was always watching. That was the thing nobody understood about a scarred man. He wasn't blind to the staring. He'd just learned to carry it, like a sack of grain balanced on one shoulder. For so long the muscle forgets what it felt like to walk without the weight. The forge was the only place the weight lifted. Fire didn't pity. Fireford just burned, same as it always had, same as it did the night it took his face and gave him in exchange. The one skill that mattered in Silver Creek. Montana Territory, the one thing that made 30 homesteads and half a cattle outfit walk through his door whether they wanted to look at him or not. They needed him, they just didn't want to need him, which was its own kind of lonely. A loneliness Garrett Vance had stopped trying to name a long time ago, because naming it made it heavier, and he already had enough to carry. Silver Creek sat low in a bowl of mountains, ringed by lodgepole pine and a creek that ran silver bright in June and froze solid by December, and it had grown up around three things: the mercantile, the church, and the smithy, in that order of importance to anyone who had actually built the place. Wagons came from 40 miles out for Garrett's iron. Ranchers who wouldn't look him in the eye still trusted him with their best horses, because a scarred hand on a hoof was still a steady hand, and steadiness was the one thing this country could not manufacture on its own. The morning it all started, frost lay thick across Main Street, and Garrett was already 3 horseshoes deep into a 6-shoe order for the Larkspur Ranch. Hammer up, hammer down. The rhythm of it was almost a prayer. Almost. Sweat cut clean lines through the soot on his forearms even in the cold, and the bellows breathed behind him like something alive. And for a few hours every morning the world narrowed down to iron and heat and the particular music a hammer makes against a good anvil, and that narrowing was the closest thing to peace Garrett Vance ever let himself have. Old Higgins, who ran the mercantile and considered himself the philosopher king of Silver Creek's gossip, leaned against the doorframe of the smithy with his thumbs in his suspenders, the way he did most mornings when the cold kept his own customers slow to arrive. Heard you're still not married, Vance. Garrett didn't look up. Heard you're still not paying your tab, Fairpoint. Higgins chuckled. Didn't leave, though. Never did. You ever think about it? A wife? Every man thinks about it, but you don't do anything about it. Garrett set the hammer down, wiped his hands on the leather apron, looked at Higgins with the whole of his face, the smooth side and the ruined one both, because he'd learned that was the fastest way to end a conversation he didn't want to have. It worked. Mostly. Higgins cleared his throat. There's a fella over in Bozeman placed one of them matrimonial notices. Newspaper thing. Got himself a wife from Ohio inside of 2 months. Good for him, just saying. Might be worth a try. For a man who what? Higgins? The old shopkeeper had the decency to look uncomfortable, which was rare, which was, in its own strange way, almost a kindness. Nothing, Higgins said. Nothing at all. But it wasn't nothing, because 11 years was a long time to eat supper alone, and a longer time still to lie awake in a two-room house, listening to wind move through pine trees like something searching for a door. And Garrett Vance had gotten very good at pretending that particular ache was just the ordinary weather of a man's life. He fed himself, kept his own accounts, mended his own shirts badly, and told himself that was enough. The way a man tells himself a lot of things in the years after a fire, has decided which parts of him get to be looked at, and which parts get to be endured. He thought about supper that night. Beans again, bread gone a little still sake, and about the particular silence of his own kitchen, and about Higgins standing in the doorway that morning, not quite finishing his sentence. For a man who... There were 100 ways to end that sentence, and Garrett had heard most of them over the years, usually not said to his face. For a man who looks like that. For a man who scares children before they get close enough to see he's gentle. For a man whose own reflection has been a stranger to him for over a decade. He ate his beans. He banked the forge, he told himself. The way he'd told himself for 11 years, that this was simply the shape a life could take, and that a man could build something honest out of even a shape like this one. But that night, alone in the back room he'd built onto the smithy, one bed, one chair, one window that looked out at nothing but dark pine and darker sky, something in him didn't want to accept that shape anymore. He sat at the small table with a pencil stub and a sheet of paper and stared at it like it might bite him. He'd thought about it before. Of course he had. 11 years of suppers eaten alone did that to a man. But thinking about a thing and doing it were two different animals entirely, and Garrett had never been one to chase what he couldn't have. Except that night, the cabin felt smaller than usual. Except the wind through the pines sounded like something searching. Except he was 38 years old and had showed every horse in 3 counties, and still came home to a cold stove and a colder bed, and something in him. Something stubborn. Something that refused to just lie down and accept the shape his life had taken. Picked up that pencil. He wrote the truth. Because lying felt like a losing bet before it even started. Blacksmith, Silver Creek, Montana Territory. 38 years of age, steady trade. Own land, own forge, own home, paid in full. I am not a handsome man and will not pretend otherwise. I was burned in a fire some years past, saving horses from a barn that could not be saved, and I bear the marks of that night across half my face, plain for anyone to see. I do not hide it and will not have a wife who is ashamed to be seen beside it. I seek a woman who values honesty above flattery and steadiness above romance. I can offer a roof that does not leak, a fire that does not go cold, and respect that does not waver. I cannot offer more than that. I will not offer less. He read it 4 times. He expected to find a reason to burn it instead of send it. Each time he found instead that the words held. They were plain. They were true. And true things, he'd learned, tended to survive their own reading better than anything dressed up to sound prettier than it was. Then he folded it, sealed it, and wrote it to the stage office before he could talk himself out of it. Because if he waited until morning, morning would bring sense, and sense would bring silence, and silence he already had plenty of. 2,000 miles east, in a narrow brick boarding house on the edge of Boston's Harbor District, Verity Holloway was learning what it meant to be too much. Not too much in spirit. Never that Verity had buried a husband, buried a business, and buried, most days, most hours, the grief of being looked at like a specimen instead of a person, and she had done all of it without breaking. No. Verity Holloway was too much in the most literal sense a body could be. 6.5 feet of her, broad through the shoulder, strong through the hand, built. As her late husband Thomas used to say, laughing, delighted, never once ashamed, like the granite he cut for a living, Thomas Holloway had run the finest granite works in Suffolk County. And Verity, who could lift a quarried block that took 2 ordinary men to shift, had worked beside him for 9 years. Not behind him, beside him. She'd hauled stone, she'd kept the ledgers, she'd stood at his shoulder while he negotiated contracts with railroad men who tried not to stare and mostly failed. She knew the quarry better than any foreman he'd ever hired, knew which seams ran clean and which would crack a saw blade in half, knew the names and families of every man who worked the pit, and had, more than once, hauled a fallen beam off a trapped worker's leg with her bare hands, while Thomas shouted for a doctor. They had been, by any honest account, a partnership. Thomas used to say it plainly, in front of clients who blinked at the sight of her, "My wife." Built half this business with her own 2 hands, and the other half wouldn't stand without her ledgers keeping it upright. He never once treated her size as something to explain or apologize for. He treated it the way he treated good granite, as a fact of considerable value, plainly visible, requiring no defense. And when the consumption took him in the winter of 1885 quiet, in his sleep, her hand wrapped around his enormous, work-scared one. She had stood at the graveside taller than every mourner present and felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely small. There had been no children. There had been, after the funeral, a business partner named Otis Kellerman who smiled at her with his hat in his hands and his lawyer in his pocket. Now, Mrs. Holloway, Kellerman's voice always had that oil to it. The voice of a man selling something he knew you didn't want, a woman running a quarry. Alone, it isn't seemly. I ran it beside my husband for 9 years, Mr. Kellerman. Beside him. Yes, a pause, calculated, not without him, which was, Verity would come to understand, the whole of it, not without him. As if her hands had only ever been an extension of Thomas's, as if the strength in her arms belonged to him, and had simply been on loan, and now that he was gone, the debt had come due. Kellerman's lawyer produced papers that said, in language dense enough to hide the knife inside it, that the quarry's operating rights transferred fully to the surviving partner in the event that the widow was deemed. The word made Verity's stomach turn even now, months later, unsuited to continue the enterprise, unsuited, because she was a woman, because she was, by every measure society cared to take, strange to look at, because a 6.5-foot widow standing at the head of a boardroom table made investors nervous, in a way that had nothing to do with her competence, and everything to do with the fact that men did not know where to put their eyes when they looked at her, and men who did not know where to put their eyes tended eventually to simply look away from the whole situation entirely. Hahe had fought. She had walked into every meeting Kellerman's lawyers scheduled, laid her own ledgers on the table beside theirs, and answered every question about the quarry's operation faster and more precisely than any of the men across from her could ask them. It hadn't mattered. The board had already decided what it wanted to see before she walked in the door, and 6 months of fighting it, with what little money remained to her, only ended in the lawyers wearing her down to a settlement that left her with train fare and a trunk and very little else. And so Verity Holloway had come, at last, to a narrow room above a Boston boarding house, cooking and mending for $11 a month, folding herself, always folding, always compressing, always trying to occupy less space than her body demanded, into a life that fit her the way a child's coat fits a grown woman. Which is to say, not at all. She ducked under door frames that weren't built for her. She sat at the edge of church pews so her shoulders wouldn't crowd her neighbors. She learned to enter a room a half step behind whoever she was with, so that the first gasp, the first stare, would land on someone else's face for at least a heartbeat longer. 8 months of that. 8 months of being managed, accommodated, apologized around, until the very idea of taking up the space she actually occupied had come to feel like a kind of theft. It was Nora Fitch, Wolf the boarding house cook, slid the newspaper across the kitchen table, one gray, November evening, Nora was a wide, weathered woman, with flour permanently ground into the creases of her knuckles, and she had the bluntness of someone who had buried two husbands of her own and had run clean out of patience for delicacy. Matrimonial notices, Nora said, tapping the column with one flour-dusted finger. Don't make that face at me, Verity Holloway. I'm not making a face. You're making the face. The one where you decide something's beneath you before you've even read it. Nora sat down across from her, heavy, final, the way she did everything. My cousin went west on one of these. Got herself a wheat farmer in Nebraska and a house with 4 rooms and nobody in it looking at her like she owed them an apology for existing. Verity said nothing, which Nora, correctly, took as permission. You think Boston's got something better waiting on you. Because from where I'm standing, Boston's had 8 months to offer you something better and hasn't managed it yet. That landed. Because it was true, and because Verity had never been able to argue with true things, only avoid them, and Nora Fitch was not a woman who allowed avoidance at her own kitchen table. That night, by a single candle burning low in its dish, Verity read the notices. Most of them she discarded within a sentence. A widower in Colorado wanted a woman of pleasing disposition and modest appetite. A rancher in Wyoming described his ideal bride in terms so precise: height, weight, hair color, temperament, that Verity felt herself shrink just reading it. Felt the old familiar flinch of I would not qualify. I have never qualified. I am always the exception nobody accounts for. A merchant in Idaho wanted, in his own words, a helpmate of quiet obedience, which Verity translated correctly as a man who wanted a servant he wouldn't have to pay wages. And then, one notice. Near the bottom of the column, plain black type with no flourish to it at all. She read it once. Then she read it again, slower. I am not a handsome man, and will not pretend otherwise. There was something in that sentence that reached up across 2,000 miles of railroad track and touched something raw in her chest. Because she knew that sentence. She had lived a version of it her entire adult life. The exhausting labor of getting ahead of the world's judgment before the world could deliver it, of saying, here is the thing you will notice about me, say it now. Get it over with. And here was a man in Montana Territory doing the very same thing, with a fire instead of a body, with a scar instead of 6 extra inches of height that no dress pattern in Boston had ever once accounted for. I do not hide it, and will not have a wife who is ashamed to be seen beside it. Verity Holloway set the paper down, picked it back up, read it a 3rd time, and thought, he is not asking anyone to shrink. Which was, she realized with a strange tightness in her throat, the first time in 8 months anyone at all in any newspaper, in any parlor, in any lawyer's office, had said anything close to that. She wrote to him that week. She did not embellish. She did not, as she watched her own hand move the pen across the page, allow herself the small mercy of omission. She told him her height plainly, in feet and inches, the way he had told her his scars. She told him about Thomas, about the quarry, about Kellerman, and the word unsuited, and the shame of being pushed out of a life she had built with her own 2 enormous, capable hands. She told him she was strong enough to split cordwood and stubborn enough that she'd once out-argued a Boston Railroad attorney until he'd simply left the room. She told him she did not know how a Montana winter behaved and would need teaching. She told him, at the very end, in a line she almost crossed out 3 times before letting it stand, I have spent a great deal of my life being looked at. I would like, for once, to be seen instead. If that is a thing you can offer, I believe I could learn to love a quiet life in a place that does not already have an opinion of me. She sealed it before she could take it back. The letter reached Garrett Vance on a Tuesday, carried in the leather satchel of the eastbound-turned-westbound stage, and he read it, standing in the doorway of his forge, with soot still on his hands. And something happened in his chest that he did not have a word for, because most replies to his notice, and there had been 3, only 3, in 2 months, had come from women who wanted reassurance, who wanted him to promise, between the lines, that the scars weren't really so bad, that surely it wasn't as he'd described, that surely he was being modest. One woman had asked, with breathtaking directness, whether he might consider growing a beard to cover the worst of it. Another had written 3 full pages about her own considerable virtues, without once acknowledging that he had written anything at all, as though his letter had been a formality to get past rather than a thing worth reading. Verity Holloway's letter asked for none of that. She had simply told him the truth about herself, in the same flat, unflinching register he had used to tell the truth about himself, and somewhere in the reading of it Garrett Vance, a man who had not let himself want anything in 11 years, because wanting things led to disappointment, and disappointment he had a lifetime's fill of already, felt a dangerous stirring of hope. He read the letter 3 more times that evening, sitting by the forge with the coals banked low, and each time he found something new in it. The line about Thomas, not behind him, beside him, struck something loose in his chest, because he understood, in a way few men would have, exactly what it cost a person to build something with their own hands, and then watch strangers decide those hands didn't count. He wrote back that same night. He told her about the winters here, the particular way the light fell across the valley in October, the sound his hammer made against good iron. He told her about Higgins and his endless gossip, about the church at the end of Main Street, about the little 2-room house he'd built with his own hands, years before the fire had changed the shape of the man living in it. He did not, in that first reply, ask her a single question about her size. He simply wrote as though the fact of it had already been settled between them, because, in the reading of her letter, it had. He did not know, as he sealed the envelope, that he was setting in motion a chain of events that would end with the entire town of Silver Creek standing in stunned silence on a Thursday afternoon, in autumn, watching a woman step down from a stagecoach and change, without meaning to, everything they thought they understood about who deserved to be stared at and who did not. The correspondence went on through the winter and into the spring. 4 letters, then 6, then a dozen, each one a little less careful than the last, the way trust builds, not all at once but brick by brick, the way Verity herself had once built stone walls with her own 2 hands. She told him about the sound Boston Harbor made at night, the particular clang of rigging against masts that had lulled her to sleep for 34 years. He told her about the blue of a Montana sky just before a hailstorm, the kind of blue that made a man stop his hammer mid-swing just to look at it. She told him she snored, apparently, according to Thomas, who had never once complained about it. He told her he talked in his sleep sometimes, old ranch songs from before the fire, and that the sound of his own voice doing it always woke him up half ashamed. She told him about the quarry, in more detail now that the first wound of it had scarred over enough to speak of plainly. The particular satisfaction of a clean cut through good granite, the way Thomas used to whistle low through his teeth when a block came free exactly as planned. He told her about Etta Calloway, though he didn't yet know her name would come to matter as much as it eventually did. Just a mention in passing, of a child who liked to watch the sparks fly, and wasn't afraid of much of anything. They were, both of them, without quite naming it, falling into the intimacy of 2 people who had given up believing anyone would ever choose them, and were slowly, carefully, allowing themselves to be wrong about that by March. The letters had stopped asking questions and started making plans. By April, Garrett had begun, without telling anyone, clearing a second garden bed behind the house and building a proper set of shelves into the wall by the stove, wide enough and sturdy enough that they would not need replacing for a woman of any particular size. By the time the letter came setting a date, Garrett proposing marriage in writing, formal as a land deed, because he did not trust himself to say it any other way, Verity had already sold what little furniture remained to her name and packed a single trunk. Nora Fitch stood on the boarding house steps the morning she left. Arms crossed, eyes suspiciously bright. "You sure about this?" "No," Verity said honestly, "but I was sure about staying, and staying was killing me an inch at a time." I'd rather be unsure and moving than sure and standing still. Nora nodded. Once. The way she did everything. Send word when you get there. And Verity. She caught her hand. Calloused fingers wrapping around calloused fingers. Two working women who understood each other in the language of hands that had never been permitted to be soft. Don't you dare fold yourself up smaller for these Montana people. You hear me? Not 1 inch. Verity did not know, boarding that train, whether she could keep that promise. She was about to find out. It took the better part of the summer to settle what little remained of her affairs and arrange the long passage west, and by the time she finally boarded the train, she had stopped counting the months and started simply counting the miles. The stagecoach rolled into Silver Creek on a cold Thursday afternoon in October of 1887, and word that the blacksmith's mail-order bride had finally arrived traveled down Main Street, faster than the dust the wheels kicked up. By the time the coach groaned to a halt outside the stage office, a crowd had gathered. Not a large one. Silver Creek was not a large town, but large enough. Large enough for the electric hush of a community braced to witness something it expected to enjoy at someone else's expense. Old Higgins stood in his mercantile doorway. Two ranch wives paused mid-conversation with market baskets on their hips. A cluster of men outside the saloon turned as one, the way men do when they sense a spectacle is imminent, and one of them, young, unshaven, knew enough to town that he didn't know better, said something low that made the others laugh. They expected, all of them, to watch a woman step down from that coach, take one look at Garrett Vance's ruined face and falter. That was the story they'd already written in their heads. That was the entertainment they'd assembled to watch. The coach door opened, and what came down out of it made every single one of them forget entirely about Garrett Vance's scars, because Verity Holloway did not step down so much as unfold. Down and further down still, until she stood on the packed dirt of Main Street, a full head and shoulders above the tallest man present. A woman built on a scale that Silver Creek, a town that had, until this exact moment, considered itself thoroughly unshockable, had genuinely never seen before. The silence that followed was not the silence of politeness. Someone in the crowd actually gasped, an honest, audible gasp, quickly muffled behind a gloved hand. One of the ranch wives dropped a tin of preserves clean out of her basket, and the sound of it hitting the dirt seemed, in that frozen moment, deafeningly loud. Verity Holloway heard all of it. She had heard it before, in Boston, in every city she'd ever passed through, in every doorway that required her to duck, in every dress shop that had no pattern to fit her, and no clerk with the grace not to say so aloud. She knew, with the flat, practiced precision of someone who had catalogued every possible reaction a stranger's face could make, exactly what was happening around her. I would like, for once, to be seen instead. Her own words came back to her, cruel in their irony, standing there on a Montana street, with 200 eyes crawling over every inch of her. And that was when she saw him. Garrett Vance had come straight from the forge, hadn't even stopped to change, and he stood at the edge of the crowd, with his leather apron still on, and his hat in both hands, gripping the brim so hard his knuckles had gone white. He had scrubbed his face and hands in honor of her arrival, and the washing had only made the scar tissue plainer in the flat afternoon light. Pale, ridged, unmistakable, running from jaw to temple, he was braced. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the stillness of a man already braced to be found wanting. He had spent 11 years learning exactly what it looked like when Schlott's force changed the instant they truly saw him, and he was waiting. Right now, in front of the whole town, for hers to do the same. Except she wasn't looking at his scars, she was looking at his eyes. And what she found there stopped her cold, right there in the street. Half the town still gawking at her like she'd sprouted a second head, because his eyes held no revulsion, no judgment. What Garrett Vance's face held, plain as anything, was the exact same fear she carried in her own chest every single day of her life. Please don't look at me like I'm a mistake. Please don't be the person who confirms what I already believe about myself. Two people, two kinds of too much. Standing in a dusty street in Montana territory, each one braced for the other to flinch. Neither of them did. Verity crossed the boardwalk toward him, and even that simple act, the length of her stride, made the crowd shift back half a step without meaning to, and she looked directly at the ruined side of his face. Openly. Without the polite, careful sliding away of the eyes that he had learned, over 11 years, to expect from absolutely everyone. Then she extended her hand. "Mr. Vance," she said, and her voice carried, clear and steady, meant for the whole street to hear. "I'm Verity. You wrote a very honest letter. I've come a long way on the strength of it." For a moment, one long, suspended moment, Garrett could not make his mouth work, because nobody had ever done that. Not once in 11 years. Nobody had crossed a public street to shake his hand like. The meeting itself was the thing worth remarking on, and not his face. "Ma'am," he finally managed, and his voice came out rougher than he'd meant it to. There's a wagon for your trunk. House is just up the rise. Somewhere behind them, the crowd, which had assembled for one story and was now, visibly confused about which story it had actually gotten, began to lose interest and drift apart. A few of the men outside the saloon exchanged glances. The ranch wife bent to retrieve her spilled tin of preserves, muttering something Verity didn't catch and didn't need to. "Then let's go home," Verity said, "and you can tell me what a blacksmith eats for supper, because I intend to cook it better." Something moved across Garrett's face then. Not quite a smile. He'd forgotten how those worked around strangers. But close enough. And the thing neither of them could have known. Walking that dusty half-mile up the rise toward the little house behind the smithy was that the crowd's stunned silence in the street was only the first of many. Silver Creek had built its entire understanding of these two people around what it expected to see. It was about to spend the next several months being wrong about almost everything. The house was small. 2 rooms, swept clean, a wood stove, already lit against the October chill. Garrett had built the ceiling himself years back, never once thinking he'd need to build it for a woman who'd have to duck under the doorframe. And the sight of her ducking, automatically, without complaint, the practiced motion of a lifetime, made something twist in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Guilt, maybe. Or recognition. An old, familiar ache. Watching someone else perform the same daily accommodations he'd spent 11 years performing himself, just for a different reason. There was a jar of late wildflowers on the table. He'd cut them that morning. This enormous scarred man, standing awkwardly in a meadow with a fistful of asters, and then plainly not known what to do with them once he'd gotten them home. Verity stood in the doorway, had to angle herself slightly to fit through it, and looked at that jar of drooping flowers for a long moment before she trusted her own voice. "It isn't much," Garrett said from behind her, turning his hat in his hands again. "Old habit, the bed's yours. I'll take the lean-to off the forge till you say otherwise." "It's more than I've had in a long while," Verity said, and meant every word of it. She walked the length of the little house. That first evening, 3 steps in one direction, 4 in the other, running her hand along the shelves he'd built too wide and too sturdy, the ones she hadn't yet realized he'd made specially for her, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the day Kellerman's lawyer had slid those papers across her own parlor table. They were married that Sunday, in the small white church at the end of Main Street, by a circuit preacher who'd ridden 3 days to reach them. 2 witnesses, no celebration to speak of. Verity wore her good gray traveling dress, which she'd had to let out at the shoulders herself the night before. And when the preacher asked Garrett to speak his vows, his voice cracked clean in half on the 3rd word, and Verity reached over without hesitation and closed her enormous hand around his scarred one, and held it steady until he found his voice again. The men who'd laughed outside the saloon on Thursday were not laughing on Sunday. The first weeks were careful. Careful the way 2 people are careful around something they're both afraid of breaking. Because they are, in fact, both afraid of breaking it. Garrett rose before first light and worked until the lamps came on. Verity turned the small house into something that resembled a home. Curtains at the windows, sewn from fabric she'd carried folded at the bottom of her trunk, bread rising by the stove, his torn work shirts mended in the evening while he sat across the room, pretending to read the almanac and stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She noticed every single time. She let him think she didn't, because that was its own kind of gift she was learning. The gift of letting a careful man be careful, of not rushing the slow thaw of someone who had spent 11 winters convincing himself he deserved the cold. It was Verity, in the second week, who first split cordwood in the yard while Garrett was at the forge, and it was Garrett who came around the corner of the house to find her mid-swing, axe rising and falling with an ease that split a log clean in one stroke. A log it would have taken most men 2 strikes to manage, and simply stopped where he stood. She caught him staring. Old fear flickered across her face, fast, there and gone. The dread of now he sees. Now he understands what he's actually married. Now the letters and the honesty in the wedding. All curdle into regret. Don't, she started. Already bracing, already beginning the familiar work of making herself smaller in her own doorway. That's the finest wood splitting I've seen since my father passed, Garrett said. Plain. No hesitation in it at all. Man used to split a cord a day and brag about it at the mercantile. You just did half that in 10 minutes, and didn't even take your gloves off. Verity blinked. You're not, she stopped. Started again. Most men find it unsettling. Most men, Garrett said, have never had to shoe a horse one-handed because the other hand's too scarred to grip the file proper. Strength doesn't unsettle me, Verity. Never has. A pause. Something almost wry crossing the good side of his face. Unless it's aimed at me. You aiming that axe at me? Not today. Then I reckon I'll live. It was in its small way, the first joke either of them had risked with the other. And the sound of Verity's laugh, real, surprised out of her, echoing off the pine tree line behind the house, was a sound Garrett Vance would remember for the rest of his life as the exact moment the house stopped. Feeling like a careful arrangement between strangers and started, very quietly, feeling like something else entirely. What changed everything, what truly, finally cracked the careful shell both of them had been living inside, was a child. Her name was Etta Calloway. 7 years old. Daughter of the widow who ran Silver Creek's boarding house at the far end of town. And Etta had decided, with the unshakable logic that belongs only to 7-year-olds, that Garrett Vance's forge was the single most wonderful place in the entire territory. She liked the orange glow of the coals. She liked the hiss when hot iron met the water trough. She liked the way sparks scattered upward like a swarm of trapped fireflies finally let loose. Her mother had warned her off it. Stay away from the blacksmith, Etta. He isn't right to look at. And the other children in town, repeating things they'd heard from parents who should have known better, had told her the fire had marked him because the devil had a hand in it. Etta had considered this claim with the seriousness of a small judge weighing evidence and rejected it outright, because monsters, in her considerable experience, did not spend their Tuesday afternoons bending scraps of iron into tiny galloping horses for children who had no business hanging around a working forge in the first place. That had started weeks before Verity's arrival. Garrett, catching the girl watching from the fence one afternoon, and instead of chasing her off the way half the town might have expected, cooling a scrap of iron and bending it 3 quick strokes into the shape of a small horse mid-gallop, setting it on the fence rail without a word, going back to his work. Etta had slept with that little iron horse under her pillow for a week straight. She'd been coming back ever since. Verity found the 2 of them on a gold, low-slanting afternoon, not long after her arrival. Garrett crouched down at a child's height beside the forge, patiently showing Etta how the bellows breathed new life into dying coals, and the little girl gazing up at the ruined side of his face with absolutely no fear in her at all, only delight, only the open, unguarded curiosity that belongs to children before the world teaches them what they're supposed to be afraid of. Verity stood very still in the doorway and watched, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since Boston, since Kellerman's oiled voice, since the word unsuited, loosened, just slightly, just for a moment. Over the following weeks, Etta became a fixture of the household in her own small way. She learned Verity's name the second day and used it constantly, with the particular satisfaction children take in a new word they've mastered. She asked Verity, with total sincerity, whether it was true that giants in stories were always wicked, and seemed genuinely relieved when Verity told her that the wicked giants in stories were invented by ordinary-sized people who'd never actually met one. "So you're not wicked," Etta said, as though settling the matter for good. "Not on Tuesdays," Verity said, and Etta laughed so hard she had to sit down on the fence rail. That evening, after Etta had gone home clutching a second iron horse, Garrett sat across the small table from Verity and turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "She's not scared of me," he said quietly, as if it still astonished him. "Even now, even after weeks of watching it happen. Everybody's scared of me, Verity. One way or another. Even the ones that don't show it, they're managing me, being careful. She just isn't. She just looks. Children see what's actually there," Verity said. "It's us of us who have to learn it back. Took me 34 years and a dead husband to remember. I'm allowed to take up space in a room. Etta's 7 and she's never had to unlearn a single thing." Garrett was quiet a moment. "You ever going to tell me," he said, careful, testing the words before he let them fully out, "what it was your husband's partner did? You've mentioned it. Never told it whole." And Verity, who had spent 8 months in Boston keeping that wound sealed tight, who had told the story in careful, clipped fragments even to Nora, even to herself, found, sitting at that small table with the wood stove ticking and Garrett Vance's ruined, honest face across from her, that she wanted, for the first time, to say the whole of it. "Thomas built that quarry with his hands and mine both," she said. 9 years, I hauled stone same as any man on that crew. Kept the books besides. Sat at his shoulder in every meeting he ever took. And the day we buried him, before the dirt was even settled proper, his partner had a lawyer standing Mamaripa with papers saying I was." Her voice caught, just slightly, and she pushed through it, unsuited to continue the business. Unsuited. 9 years, Garrett. 9 years of my own hands on that stone, and one word from a man in a good suit undid the whole of it. What'd you do? Fought it far as my money held out. Lost anyway. She turned her cup. Same slow motion he'd used a moment before, the small unconscious mirroring of two people learning each other's rhythms. "I keep thinking on it. How a man can look right at what a woman's built with her own 2 hands, and still decide. The hands don't count for anything. If the rest of the world's uncomfortable looking at her while she uses them." Garrett reached across the table, slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away, and closed his hand, scarred and enormous in its own right, over hers. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've watched you split cordwood, haul water, and out-arg Higgins about the price of nails in the same week you got off that stage. Way I see it, any man who calls it unsuited never had the sense God gave a fence post." It was, Verity thought later, lying awake and listening to the silence of a Montana night, the first time in 8 months anyone had said something about her strength that didn't sound like either a warning or an apology. Winter closed in slow that year, the way it does in high country. First frost, then hard frost, then the kind of cold that turned the water trough to ice by morning and made every chore a small negotiation with the elements. Verity learned to read the sky the way Garrett read a piece of iron, learned which clouds meant snow by nightfall and which just meant wind, learned the hush of a Montana blizzard settling over a valley. She also learned, in those slow winter weeks, that Silver Creek had not entirely finished having opinions about her. Not everyone, old Higgins, had come around fast enough. Mostly because Verity paid her tab in full and on time, which endeared her to a shopkeeper faster than almost anything else could. The ranch wife who dropped her preserves that first day, a soft-spoken woman named Dora Prentice, had taken to leaving cuttings from her kitchen garden on Verity's porch rail. Small silent offerings that said more than any conversation might have. By December, Dora was stopping by most Sundays, with a jar of something put up from her own cellar, and the two women had settled into the particular ease of neighbors who didn't need to fill every silence to enjoy each other's company. But there was a man named Silas Pruitt, who ran the only bank for 40 miles, and Silas Pruitt had a way of looking at Verity that made the hair on her arms rise. Not the open gawking of strangers, which she'd learned to weather, but something colder, something calculating. As though he were doing sums behind his eyes and she was, somehow, a figure in a column that didn't balance the way he wanted. She mentioned it to Garrett once, in passing, and watched his jaw tighten in a way she hadn't seen before. "Pruitt's got no quarrel with you," he said. "Too quick, too careful. Man's just naturally unpleasant. Ask anyone." But Verity Holloway had spent 9 years reading the fine print on business contracts, and she recognized, even then, even that early, the texture of a man being less than fully honest. She let it go. For now. Because outside, the first true snow of the season was starting to fall, soft and steady, over the pine ridge, and inside the wood stove was warm. And Etta Calloway's newest little iron horse sat on the windowsill catching the last of the daylight. And for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, Verity Holloway felt something that was not quite happiness. Not yet, not fully. Grief doesn't release its hold that easily, but was, unmistakably, its early and welcome cousin. She did not know yet about the letter, already making its way west from Boston, carried in careful lawyer's script, addressed to Mrs. Verity Holloway Vance, care of Silver Creek, Montana Territory. She did not know that Otis Kellerman had not, in fact, finished with her. She did not know that Silas Pruitt's cold, calculating stare had almost nothing to do with her size, and almost everything to do with a survey map of railroad right-of-way. Currently sitting locked in his bank's back office, a map that ran directly through the parcel of land beneath Garrett Vance's forge. She only knew that the snow was falling, and the fire was warm. And for the first time in 8 months, she had stopped, soft, without quite noticing when, trying to make herself smaller. Outside, the wind picked up over the ridge, carrying the first hard bite of the winter to come. And somewhere down at the stage office, though neither of them would learn of it for another week, yet, an envelope addressed in unfamiliar hand had already arrived, waiting. The envelope had been sitting at the Silver Creek stage office for 6 days, before anyone thought to write it up the rise. Which was how things worked in a town with 1 stage a week, and 1 postmaster who considered mail delivery a personal inconvenience. So when Garrett finally carried it home, snow still melting off his shoulders, he didn't think much of it. Just another piece of paper. Just another thing the world wanted from him. Except it wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to Mrs. Verity Holloway Vance, in a lawyer's careful, slanted hand, and the return address said Boston, and Verity's whole body went still the moment she saw it. Still in a way Garrett had learned to recognize. The stillness of a woman bracing for a blow she'd already survived once, and hoped never to survive again. "You don't have to open it tonight," Garrett said. "Yes, I do." She was already breaking the seal. "Waiting doesn't make bad news smaller, Garrett. It just makes you tired before it arrives." She read it once. Fast. Then again slower, her jaw tightening with every line. "What is it?" Elias Thorne. Her voice had gone flat, careful. The voice of someone reading numbers off a ledger that didn't balance. "Attorney, representing Otis Kellerman's interests, says the Quarries Board has reconsidered the matter of the widow's residual claim." She set the letter down like it had gone cold in her hands. "Says a representative will be traveling west to discuss final settlement. In person. Final settlement of what? Of me, Garrett. Final settlement of whether I get to keep $1 single of 9 years' work." She laughed, short, no humor in it at all. "I thought it was finished. I thought I signed the last of it and came 2,000 miles so it would stay finished." Garrett didn't say anything clever. Didn't try to fix it with words, because some things words didn't fix. And he'd learned that, 11 years ago, standing in front of a mirror he eventually stopped looking into. He just pulled a chair around next to hers, sat down, put his scarred hand over hers on the table, same as he had that first night she'd told him about Kellerman, and let the silence do what silence sometimes did better than talking. Outside, the wind picked up over the ridge. Neither of them knew yet that Boston wasn't the only trouble already riding toward Silver Creek that week. Silas Pruitt came to the forge on a Tuesday, and Garrett knew, before the man even swung down off his horse, that it wasn't going to be a friendly visit. Pruitt didn't do friendly. Pruitt did calculated every single time, the way some men did charm and others did cruelty. Smooth, practiced, always a half step ahead of whatever conversation he was actually having. Vance Pruitt didn't offer a hand. Never did. We need to discuss the note on your east parcel. Note's not due till spring. Circumstances change. Pruitt pulled a folded paper from his coat, precise as a man dealing cards he already knew the outcome of. Banks had to reassess certain properties. Given recent developments, what developments? Railroads sending survey men through the territory come summer. Word is the line might run straight through this valley. Pruitt's eyes flicked briefly, deliberately, toward the smithy's east boundary, toward Garrett's own land, the exact strip of it that ran along the creek. Land along a rail corridor's worth considerably more than land that isn't. Banks simply protecting its interests. Nothing personal, Vance. Nothing personal. Garrett's voice had gone quiet. Dangerous quiet. The kind of quiet that made grown men in Silver Creek find urgent business. Elsewhere, you're calling my note early because you think my land's about to be worth something. That's not protecting the bank's interest, Pruitt. That's stealing it out from under me before I know what it's worth. That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate one. Pruitt smiled. Thin. The kind of smile that never once touched anything above his mouth. Man in your position ought to watch his tone. Man in your position. He let the words hang there a moment, deliberate, cruel in the quiet way he preferred. Half his was burned off and married to a well. A woman built like a barn door. Man in that position doesn't have a great deal of standing to make demands, does he? The forge went silent. Because that was the thing about Silas Pruitt. He never raised his voice, never needed to. He just found the exact soft place where a man's pride lived and pressed on it, gently, patiently, until something gave. Garrett's hand had closed around the hammer on the anvil before he'd consciously decided to reach for it, which was exactly when Verity came around the corner of the smithy, a basket of mending balanced on one hip, and heard the last of it. Heard barn door. Heard the curdled satisfaction in Pruitt's voice, the tone of a man who'd been saving that line, polishing it, waiting for the right moment to use it. She set the basket down. Slow. Deliberate, Mr. Pruitt, her voice carried across the yard, level as a plumb line. I don't believe we've been introduced. Pruitt turned, and Verity watched. She'd watched this exact sequence happen 100 times in her life, in Boston, in every town between there and here. Watched the man's eyes travel up and up and up, the way they always did, the arithmetic strangers performed on her body, before they'd said a single word to her face. Mrs. Vance, he recovered fast. Men like Pruitt always did. I was just discussing bank business with your husband. I heard what you were discussing. She crossed the yard toward him, and something about the length of her stride made his horse shy half of a step, sideways without him quite noticing why. Sounded a great deal less like bank business, and a great deal more like a man too small to argue numbers, so he decided to insult a face and a body instead. Which tells me the numbers must not be on your side, Mr. Pruitt. Men who are winning the argument don't usually need to reach for cruelty. I'd be careful, Mrs. Vance. Would you? She didn't blink. Didn't so much as slow down. Because from where I'm standing, you rode onto a man's own land, called his note early, on a technicality you invented yourself not 5 minutes ago, and when he pushed back, you didn't defend the technicality. You reached for his scars and my size instead. That's not banking, Mr. Pruitt. That's a man who's already lost the argument trying to win a different one. Behind her, Etta Calloway had wandered up from the fence. She'd been there the whole time, small and forgotten in the way children often were during adult conflicts, and stood watching with wide, solemn eyes, one of Garrett's little iron horses clutched in her fist. "He's not scary," Etta announced, apropos of nothing, in the clear, carrying voice children use when they've decided a thing needs saying and adults are taking too long to say it, and she's not either. "You're the scary one, mister. You've got mean eyes." A ranch hand loitering near the mercantile, there for supplies, staying now for the show, let out a short bark of laughter before he could stop himself. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Watch your child," he said to no one in particular. "She's not mine," Verity said. But she's not wrong either. For a moment nobody moved. Pruitt sat his horse, calculating. Verity could practically watch him doing it, weighing whether the fight was worth continuing in front of witnesses, who were, increasingly, not on his side, and then he gathered his reins with more force than necessary. "You'll have my formal notice by week's end. Vance," his voice had lost its silk. "Note comes due. Full payment, or the bank takes possession of the east parcel. That's not legal, and you know it. It's exactly as legal as I need it to be." Pruitt wheeled his horse. "Good day, Mrs. Vance." He rode off down the rise and the small crowd that had gathered. 3 ranch hands Higgins from the mercantile doorway. Dora Prentice with her market basket, frozen mid-step, stood in a silence that felt, this time entirely different from the one that had greeted Verity's arrival months before. This silence had teeth, and for once, none of them were pointed at Garrett or Verity. "Well," Higgins said finally, to no one in particular, "that man's always had a mean streak. Didn't know it ran quite that deep." Garrett hadn't moved from the anvil, hadn't set down the hammer. And when Verity turned to look at him, she found something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not humiliation, which was what she'd braced for, but something closer to shock, as though Pruitt's cruelty had cracked something open that had been sealed a very long time. "Garrett, he's never gone after you before." His voice was low, strange. "Man said plenty about my face over the years. Never once cared enough to aim at anything of mine besides." Why now? Verity didn't have an answer. But she was starting, slowly, to suspect one, and it had everything to do with a railroad survey that hadn't officially happened yet. And a banknote called early on a technicality invented on the spot, and a man who didn't waste cruelty, unless cruelty was serving some purpose bigger than the moment. That night, Garrett didn't sleep. Verity woke sometime past midnight to find the bed beside her empty, and found him instead sitting at the small table in the front room, a single candle burned down to its dish, an old ledger open in front of him that he wasn't reading. "Garrett, should have told you this a long time ago." His voice came out rough, unpracticed, the way a voice sounds when it's saying words it's never said aloud before. "Should have told you before we married, even. Wasn't fair to let you come all this way and not know the whole of it." Verity sat down across from him, said nothing, waited, the way she'd learned to wait with this man, because pushing him only ever made the words retreat further. "Fire that took my face." He turned the ledger a quarter turn, though he still wasn't looking at it. 11 years back, Delacroix Barn, other side of the ridge. Story everyone knows is I went in after the horses when the roof was already catching. That part's true enough, but nobody in this town knows the barn door was latched from the outside when the fire started. His jaw worked, not jammed, not fallen shut by accident, latched, on purpose, by somebody who wanted those horses trapped. Verity felt something cold settle in her chest. Who? Jonah Pruitt. The name landed in the quiet room like a dropped stone. Silas's brother? Silas's younger brother, 17 years old that summer. Him and old man Delacroix had a falling out over grazing rights that got ugly. Jonah'd been drinking. Wanted to teach the old man a lesson, scare him some. Never meant for it to catch the way it did. Garrett's hand had gone to the ruined side of his face without him seeming to notice, an old, unconscious habit. I heard the horses screaming from half a mile off. Rode in, door wouldn't give. Had to break it down, and by the time I got it open, The whole loft was coming down. You could have died, should have by rights. A humorless, almost smile. Got the horses out. Roof came down on the way out myself. Woke up 3 days later looking like this. And, by then, Jonah Pruitt had already run clean out of the territory. And Silas. Silas closed ranks around what was left of his family so fast the whole town barely had time to ask a single question. Told everyone it was an accident. Old wiring, dry hay, bad luck. And I let him. Why? Because I was 27 years old with half my face gone and no idea yet how to live in the body I had left. And because Silas Pruitt came to me himself, private, and said if I kept quiet about Jonah he'd see to it. The bank never gave me trouble long as I lived here. Garrett finally looked up, and the shame in his face was old and deep and worn smooth with handling, the way river stones go smooth. So I kept quiet. 11 years of quiet, Verity. And I told myself it was mercy. The boy was 17 drunk. Didn't mean the horses to die, let alone me to nearly join them. But some days I think it wasn't mercy at all. Some days I think it was just fear. Easier to stay quiet than to fight a family with money and a bank both. Verity reached across the table, took his scarred hand in both of hers. And now Silas is calling the debt due, she said slowly. The very same week he starts talking railroad surveys and going after your land specific. That's not coincidence, Garrett. No. His hand tightened around hers. I don't believe it is. He's been protecting a secret for 11 years by protecting you, which means he needed you quiet and grateful. She sat back, the pieces assembling themselves in her mind, with the same methodical clarity she'd once brought to Thomas's contracts, to columns of figures that didn't balance until you found the number someone was trying to hide. But land along a railroad line's worth a fortune, Garrett. Enough money changes a man's calculations. Maybe he doesn't need you quiet anymore. Maybe he needs you gone. The candle guttered low between them. There's no proof of any of it, Garrett said. Not the fire, not the survey. Man like Pruitt doesn't leave paper trails. Then we find one, Verity said. Because I did not survive Otis Kellerman and a Boston courtroom to watch a small-town banker take a man's home on a lie he invented on horseback. I've read more crooked contracts than Silas Pruitt has had hot dinners. Garrett Vance. Let him try. Something in Garrett's chest loosened, just slightly, at the fierce certainty in her voice. The same fierce certainty that had stood her toe-to-toe with Pruitt in the yard that afternoon, unbowed, unbothered, entirely unwilling to be made smaller by a man on a horse. He almost let himself believe they could win this. He did not yet know that Silver Creek's troubles were about to be joined, within the week, by a very different kind of visitor. One who wore a good suit, carried Boston papers, and had come 2,000 miles, specifically to make Verity Holloway Vance believe she deserved nothing at all. Elias Thorne arrived on the Friday stage, and he did not look like a man built for Montana weather. He stepped down in a coat too tall for the wind, boots too clean for the mud, and a leather case tucked under one arm like a man guarding something precious, which, in a manner of speaking, he was. He was guarding Otis Kellerman's money. And Elias Thorne had built an entire career on the bloodless art of making other people's losses look, on paper, like the fairest outcome available. He found the smithy, without much trouble. Everyone in Silver Creek seemed to know exactly where the giant woman and the scarred blacksmith lived, and said so with a directness that made Thorne's mouth twitch with distaste. And he waited in the yard, composed, patient, while Garrett fetched Verity from the house. She came out wiping flour from her hands, and Thorne watched her cross the yard with the same arithmetic Silas Pruitt had performed days before, up and up, though Thorne, at least, had the professional discipline not to let his face show it for more than a heartbeat. Mrs. Vance. He extended a hand that looked absurdly small next to hers. Elias Thorne. I represent Mr. Kellerman's interests regarding the Holloway Granite Works. I remember Mr. Kellerman's interests quite well, Mr. Thorne. They cost me 9 years of my life's work. I'm here to offer resolution. He opened the leather case, produced a folder thick with paper, and Verity felt the old familiar tightness begin in her chest before he'd said another word. The dread of watching a lawyer prepare to speak a great deal in order to say something quite small and quite final. The board has conducted a full review. Given the circumstances of your departure, and in the interest of finality for all parties, Mr. Kellerman is prepared to offer a settlement. Final. Complete release of any further claim on your part, in exchange for your signature here. He turned the folder toward her. Today, if possible. I have a stage to catch Tuesday. Verity did not reach for the papers. How much? $200. Behind her, she heard Garrett's sharp intake of breath. $200. For 9 years. For a quarry she'd hauled stone in with her own hands. Kept books for. Sat in every negotiation Thomas had ever conducted. $200 was barely enough to cover the trunk she'd carried it all west in. That's an insult, Mr. Thorne. It's a generous offer, Mrs. Vance. Given the legal weakness of your position, Thorne's voice took on the patient condescension of a man explaining arithmetic to someone he assumed couldn't follow it. You'll recall the original settlement determined you were unsuited to continue active management of the enterprise. That determination stands as legal precedent. Any further claim you might attempt to press would simply reopen a matter already decided against you at considerable expense, with no guarantee of a different outcome. Unsuited. Verity's voice had gone very quiet, very still. Say the word to my face again, Mr. Thorne. I'd like to hear exactly how you mean it. Thorne blinked. Recalibrated, I only meant. You meant that a courtroom full of men decided. A woman's hands don't count as labor if the woman herself makes people uncomfortable to look at. That's what unsuited means, Mr. Thorne, and I lived inside that word for 8 months before I had the sense to leave it behind me in Boston. I did not travel 2,000 miles to have you carry it after me. Mrs. Vance, I understand this is emotional. It is accurate, Mr. Thorne, which is a different thing entirely from emotional. Though I notice men in your profession like to confuse the two. Whenever a woman disagrees with them, she crossed her arms, and even that small motion seemed to make the lawyer take an involuntary half-step back. I kept Thomas's ledgers for 9 years. Every contract, every shipment, every dollar that ever passed through that quarry has my handwriting on it somewhere. You want to talk legal weakness? Bring me a courtroom, Mr. Thorne. Bring me a judge. I will bring 9 years of my own ledgers, in my own hand, and we will see whose position is weak. Thorne's composure slipped, just slightly, just at the edges. That would be costly for both parties. Then Mr. Kellerman had best reconsider his generous offer. Verity turned to go, then paused, delivering the last of it over her shoulder with the flat precision of a closing argument. And you can tell him something else for me, Mr. Thorne. Tell him I found a place that doesn't need me to be smaller, to be welcome in it. Tell him that's worth more to me than whatever number's written on that paper. But tell him the ledgers are staying right where they are, in my trunk, in Montana, waiting on him to decide how badly he wants this finished quietly, instead of loudly. She walked back toward the house, and Garrett fell into step beside her, and it was only once they were inside, once the door had shut against the cold, and against Elias Thorne, standing bewildered in the yard, that her shoulders finally dropped, and the fierce composure cracked, just slightly, just for him to see. He offered $200, Garrett. Her voice shook finally now that there was no one left to perform strength for. 9 years. $200. You didn't sign it. No. Then you already won more today than you think you did. Garrett pulled her down onto the bench, beside the stove. An awkward maneuver, given the difference in their sizes, but one they'd found their own workable rhythm for over the winter months, and held her hand between both of his. Man like that doesn't lowball unless he's scared of what a fair number might cost his employer. You rattled him, Verity. It doesn't feel like winning. Most of it never does. Not till after. He was quiet a moment. Feels a great deal like what I've been doing 11 years. Staying quiet about Jonah Pruitt because fighting felt too big and too costly and too likely to lose. Difference is, you fought anyway. Verity looked up at him. Then maybe it's time you did too. The days that followed moved fast. Too fast. the fast of a story accelerating toward something neither of them could quite see the shape of yet. Silas Pruitt's formal notice arrived precisely as promised. Full payment on the note due within 30 days, or the bank would take possession of the east parcel of Garrett's land. Elias Thorne, rather than boarding his Tuesday stage as planned, took a room instead at the Silver Creek boarding house, which told Verity everything she needed to know about how rattled her ledger threat had actually left him. And Etta Calloway, who had the run of the whole town and the invisibility that comes with being a child adults don't think to watch their words around, came skipping up to the forge one afternoon with news that made both Garrett and Verity go very still. "Mr. Thorne's been asking Mama all sorts of questions," Etta announced, swinging on the fence rail. "About you both, and about Mr. Pruitt too. And I heard him say something funny to Mama at supper last night." "What'd he say, sweetheart?" Verity kept her voice light, careful. The tone of an adult who'd learned children told you more when they didn't feel like they were being interrogated. "He said it was interesting how two separate matters had converged on the same small town." Etta said the big words carefully, clearly repeating them by rote without fully understanding them. "And then he said something about railroads. And then Mama told him children were listening, and he got all quiet and pink in the face." Garrett and Verity exchanged a look over the top of the little girl's head. "Two separate matters," Verity said slowly, once Etta had wandered off toward the fence to visit the newest iron horse. "Converged. Meaning what?" "Meaning I don't think Elias Thorne rode 2,000 miles purely to offer him $200, Garrett." She was thinking now, fast, the old sharp instinct from 9 years of contracts waking fully for the first time since Boston. Meaning maybe Otis and Silas Pruitt aren't strangers to each other at all. Meaning maybe there's a reason a Boston lawyer and a Montana banker both showed up in the same small town in the same month. Both trying to take something that isn't theirs. Both using paperwork instead of honesty to do it. "You think they're connected, I think," Verity said. "That men who make their living moving other people's money around tend to know each other. And I think it's past time somebody in this town found out exactly how. It was Higgins, of all people, who cracked the first piece of it open. Higgins, who ran the mercantile and fancied himself Silver Creek's philosopher king of gossip. And who had, it turned out, kept every single railroad circular that had come through his store in the past year. Because he liked to read them by lamplight and imagine himself a man of commerce. Railroad ain't surveyed this valley, he told Garrett flatly, one evening, spreading a half-dozen creased circulars across the mercantile counter. "Not officially. I'd know. Every survey crew that comes through buys their supplies off me. And I ain't sold so much as a compass to a railroad man in over a year." Pruitt said. "I know what Pruitt said. Told half the town the same story. But look here." Higgins tapped one of the circulars, a formal notice from the Territorial Land Office. "This here's the actual proposed corridor. Published 2 months back. Runs through Larkspur Ranch and clean out the north end of the valley. Nowhere near your land, Vance." "Nowhere close." Garrett stared at the paper. Felt something hot and slow uncoil in his chest. Not quite relief, not yet, but the fury of finally seeing the shape of a lie he'd been standing inside of without knowing it. "He made it up. Looks that way to me." Higgins folded the circular carefully, handed it over. "Question is why a man'd invent a railroad line just to call in a note early on land it wasn't even threatening." "Because he needed a reason," Garrett said slowly. "That didn't have anything to do with Jonah." He rode home with the circular folded inside his coat, and that night at the small table with the candle burned low, he and Verity laid it all out together, the fabricated survey, the note called due on invented urgency. Elias Thorne's mysterious presence in a town that had no earthly business interesting, a Boston attorney otherwise. And pieced it together with the patient, methodical clarity of two people who had both, in their separate lives, learned to read the fine print other people hoped you wouldn't. "He's not just protecting Jonah's secret anymore," Verity said finally. "He's protecting something bigger. Money, most likely." Maybe he sold the idea of a railroad corridor to someone else. Investors. Maybe your land's part of a deal he's already made, on paper that doesn't exist yet, and he needs it in hand before anyone thinks to check whether the line's really coming through here at all. And Thorne? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. She met his eyes across the candlelight, and there was something new in her voice. Not just anger anymore, but purpose. The fire of a woman who'd spent 8 months believing. She had nothing left to fight with, and was only now remembering exactly how much she actually had. Nobody gets to use lies to take what's yours, Garrett. Not while I'm standing in this house. I built a business out of contracts and numbers for 9 years. Let's see how Silas Pruitt's numbers more to hold up against mine. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened in the worst possible place. Right in the middle of the Silver Creek town meeting, called that Sunday after church to discuss, of all things, the town's official response to the rumored railroad line. Half the valley had turned out. Ranchers, wives Higgins, with his careful stack of circulars, Dora Prentice and her husband, even Elias Thorne, lingering near the back wall in his fine coat, watching the proceedings with the studied blankness of a man who suspected, correctly, that things were about to go badly for someone. Silas Pruitt stood at the front, addressing the room with his usual smooth confidence. And given the significant increase in land values a rail corridor would bring to this valley, the bank feels it prudent to begin consolidating certain parcels, now, before speculation drives prices beyond reach for. Which parcels, Mr. Pruitt? Garrett's voice cut across the room, and every head turned. Mr. Vance, this isn't the appropriate. Which parcels? Garrett had come to the front of the room now, and Verity rose from her seat beside him, unfolding to her full height in a way that made the whole assembly go quiet in the way it always did. Because Higgins here has the actual territorial survey, published 2 months back, and it doesn't run anywhere near my land or the east parcel you called due on a technicality you invented yourself. So I'm asking you plain, in front of the whole town, which parcels are you consolidating, and why does mine keep turning up on that list? The room had gone very still. You're mistaken, Pruitt said, but something had cracked in his voice, just slightly. The first hairline fracture in 11 years of smooth control. The survey's preliminary. Subject to change. It's not preliminary, Silas. Higgins held the circular aloft like a man presenting evidence in a courtroom, which, in the makeshift justice of a Montana town meeting, he essentially was. Territorial Land Office. Don't publish preliminary maps. This here's final. Signed and dated. Whispers rippled through the room. And there's something else, Verity said, and her voice carried clean across the hall. Level and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had spent 9 years learning exactly how to hold a room's attention, with facts alone. Mr. Pruitt's been in contact with a Boston attorney named Elias Thorne, who happens to be standing right there against the back wall, and who happens to represent the very same business interests that tried to strip me of my late husband's quarry not so very long ago. Mr. Thorne, would you care to explain to this room what brings a Boston lawyer to Silver Creek? At the exact same time, Mr. Pruitt began inventing railroad surveys to seize my husband's land. Every eye in the room swung to Thorne. That is, my business here is entirely separate. Is it? Verity crossed the room toward him, and the crowd parted the way crowds always did for her, half in awe and half in something that had, over these months, quietly become respect. Because it seems remarkably convenient, Mr. Thorne, that a man trying to strip a widow of her inheritance in Boston should turn up in the exact same small Montana town where a banker is trying to strip her husband of his land, using a lie about a railroad that doesn't exist. Are you and Mr. Pruitt acquainted, Mr. Thorne? Or is this truly the most remarkable coincidence in the history of the territory? Thorne said nothing, which, in its own way, said everything. Pruitt's composure finally broke. This is absurd, he snapped, color rising in his face. I don't answer to a room full of ranchers and He stopped himself. Too late. Say it, Verity said quietly. Dangerously quiet, the same register Garrett used when he'd truly had enough. Go on, Mr. Pruitt. You've been wanting to since the day I stepped off that stage. Say it in front of the whole town this time, so everyone can hear exactly what kind of man's been holding this valley's mortgage. Pruitt's mouth worked. But 11 years of careful, controlled cruelty had never once been tested in front of a room this size, this attentive, this suddenly and completely on someone else's side. And whatever ugly word had been building behind his teeth, he swallowed it back down, unspoken, defeated by an audience he could no longer control. "This meeting is adjourned," he said instead, voice tight. "Not quite yet," Garrett said. The whole room turned back to him, because Garrett Vance, who had spent 11 years staying quiet, who had built an entire life around the discipline of not making himself a target, took a slow breath and said the thing he had never once said aloud in front of another living soul in Silver Creek. 11 years ago, I pulled 6 horses out of a burning barn on the Delacroix, spread and came out the other side looking like this. He gestured without flinching to the ruined side of his own face. The first time, Verity realized with a tightness in her throat that she had ever seen him gesture toward it rather than simply endure people looking. Whole towns always believed it was bad wiring, dry hay, bad luck. That's the story I let stand, because the man who actually latched that barn door from the outside was 17 years and drunk and scared, and I didn't have it in me to ruin a boy's whole life over one terrible night. The room had gone graveyard silent. That boy was Jonah Pruitt, Garrett said, Silas's brother. And Silas came to me himself, private right after, and made me a deal, my silence for his family's peace. And I kept that deal 11 years, because I was young and scarred, and didn't think I had the standing to fight a family with a bank behind it. He looked directly at Silas Pruitt. And for the first time since the fire, his voice did not shake. "But you've spent 11 years of gratitude trying to take my land the minute it got valuable to you. So I reckon we're square now, Silas. I kept your family's secret. You tried to steal my home. I don't believe I owe you silence anymore." Silas Pruitt stood frozen at the front of the hall, every eye in Silver Creek fixed on him. And for the first time in 11 years of careful, smiling, calculated control, he had absolutely nothing smooth left to say. It was Dora Prentice. Quiet Dora, who'd left garden cuttings on Verity's porch rail all winter without ever once being asked, who finally broke the silence. "You let that man think it was his fault," she said slowly, staring at Pruitt like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. 11 years, Silas. 11 years. This whole town's looked at Garrett Vance and thought there, but for bad luck, and the whole time you knew exactly whose fault it really was. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, voices rising. Higgins waving his railroad circular like a flag, someone demanding the sheriff be sent for. Elias Thorne slipping quietly toward the door, only to find Verity had, without seeming to move quickly at all, positioned herself directly in his path. "Going somewhere, Mr. Thorne. I have a stage to catch. You had a stage to catch 3 days ago. You stayed instead." Verity's voice was calm, almost pleasant, entirely immovable. "I think you'll be staying a while longer yet. Because I intend to find out exactly how deep this arrangement runs between you and Mr. Pruitt. And I have a strong suspicion the answer's going to matter a great deal. More than $200. Outside, the wind had picked up hard over the ridge, carrying the first real bite of the coming week's storm, and inside the hall, amid the wreckage of Silas Pruitt's careful 11-year lie, Garrett Vance stood taller than he had in over a decade, scarred face lifted, unashamed, unhidden. For the entire valley to see, he did not yet know that within the week 2 separate pieces of paper would arrive on the same day. A foreclosure notice from Pruitt's bank, filed in spite of everything, out of pure spite and desperation, and a formal notice from a Boston court that Elias Thorne, cornered and frightened, would set in motion before he ever managed to board that stage. Both papers would land on Garrett and Verity's table within hours of each other, and both of them, together, would have to decide exactly how far they were willing to fight. Not just for land and not just for money, but for the plain, simple right to be looked at, finally, as exactly who they were. The two papers arrived within an hour of each other, and Verity would remember, for the rest of her life, the cruelty of that timing. The first came by rider, straight from Pruitt's bank, and it did not bother with courtesy. Foreclosure. Full and immediate on the East parcel, effective the moment it was read aloud in front of witnesses. Which meant Pruitt had stopped pretending the note mattered, which meant this was no longer about money at all. This was about making Garrett Van disappear. Before the truth of Jonah Pruitt's barn door could finish. Spreading through the valley, the second came an hour later. In Elias Thorne's own careful hand, delivered by a boy Thorne had paid to run it up the rise, rather than face them himself. Because Thorne, cornered in that town meeting, humiliated in front of half of Silver Creek, had done the one thing frightened men in his profession always did. He'd struck first. A formal notice, a Massachusetts court date. Kellerman, apparently, intended to press the original settlement as final and binding, and to seek an injunction preventing Verity from ever raising the matter again, in any court, territory for the rest of her natural life. Verity read it standing in the yard, snow beginning to fall soft and steady around her, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. "They're trying to bury us both at once," she said. "Same week, same hour, near enough. That's not coincidence. Garrett, that's strategy. Strategy for what? For making us choose." She folded the paper slowly. "Fight yours, and I can't get to Boston in time to fight mine. Fight mine, and you lose the land while I'm gone. They know we can't be in two places at once, so they're forcing us to pick which fight to lose." Garrett was quiet a long moment, watching the snow settle on her shoulders, on the fence rail, on the little tin horse Etta had left balanced there that morning. "Then we don't pick," he said finally. "We fight both. Together, same week, same fight. However, we have to manage it." "That's not how courts work, Garrett." "Then we make it how courts work." Something had set hard in his jaw, the same stubbornness she'd first seen in a letter that refused to apologize for a scarred face. "You taught me that much already, Verity. Man doesn't have to accept the rules some other man wrote just because he wrote them first. It was Higgins, again, who found the thread that pulled the whole thing loose. Higgins, who had appointed himself unofficial detective of Silver Creek the moment the town meeting dissolved into chaos, and who arrived at the smithy 3 days later, out of breath, half frozen, and grinning like a man who'd finally found the joke he'd been waiting his whole life to tell. "Freight manifest," he announced, slapping a plush, grease-stained ledger down on Garrett's workbench. "Come through on the supply wagon last week. Buried in with the nail order, if you can believe it. Nobody reads freight manifests for fun except me, which is exactly why nobody else noticed." "Noticed what?" "Elias Thorne didn't come out here alone on Kellerman's dime." Higgins jabbed a thick finger at a line item near the bottom of the page. "Look here, wire transfer routed through the Territorial Bank, Pruitt's bank. Mind you, dated 3 weeks before Thorne ever set foot on that stage. Paid out to a Boston account. Kellerman's account." Verity leaned over the ledger and her breath caught. "Pruitt's been financing Kellerman's legal fight against me. Looks that way." Higgins straightened, pleased as a hound that's finally treed something. "Question is why a Montana banker's paying a Boston lawyer to chase a widow halfway across the country over a granite quarry that's got nothing to do with either one of them." Garrett and Verity looked at each other, and the answer arrived in both of them at nearly the same moment. "Because it's not about the quarry," Verity said slowly. "It never was. Kellerman doesn't care about $200, or 9 years of my ledgers, or whether I'm unsuited. He cares about making sure I never have the money or the standing to fight him properly. Same as Pruitt doesn't care about a railroad that isn't coming. He cares about making sure Garrett's gone before anyone digs deep enough to find Jonah's name in that fire." "Two separate men," Garrett said. "Same fear. Get rid of the two people asking too many honest questions." Except they made a mistake. Verity's voice had gone sharp now, alive with the old fire of 9 years spent, finding exactly the weak thread in someone else's careful contract. They connected themselves. On paper. In a ledger a mercantile owner in Montana territory happened to actually read. She looked at Higgins with something close to wonder. "You may have just saved us both. Wasn't nothing," Higgins said, going faintly pink. "Just don't got much else to do, most evenings." The plan came together, over 3 sleepless nights at the small kitchen table, candle burned low, the wood stove ticking against the cold. And it required something neither Garrett nor Verity had ever quite managed before. It required them to stop fighting 2 separate battles, and to fight one. Because if Pruitt was financing Thorne, then Pruitt's foreclosure and Kellerman's lawsuit weren't 2 problems. They were one problem wearing 2 coats, which meant one piece of evidence, presented in the right place, at the right time, in front of the right witnesses, could collapse both at once. If only they could get it in front of a judge who mattered before either man managed to finish what he'd started. The territorial circuit judge was due through Silver Creek in 11 days, riding the same rough loop he rode every spring, hearing whatever disputes had piled up since his last pass-through. 11 days. Which left them almost no time at all, and a foreclosure notice that could, technically, take effect long before the judge ever arrived. "We need him here sooner," Verity said. "Man rides a fixed circuit. Doesn't come early for anybody. Then we give him a reason bigger than anybody else's business waiting on him." Verity was pacing now, the small room barely containing the length of her stride, thinking out loud the way she used to when a contract wouldn't balance. Fraud. Financial fraud, spanning 2 territories, involving a banker and an attorney conspiring against 2 separate citizens. That's not a grazing dispute, Garrett. That's the kind of thing a circuit judge rides ahead of schedule to see for himself because it makes his whole career if he's the one who catches it. You think Higgins's ledger is enough to prove that? Not by itself, but it's enough to ask a judge to look further. And once a judge starts looking, Pruitt and Kellerman have got to keep their stories straight across 2,000 miles. With a Boston lawyer sitting scared in a Montana boarding house, and a bank president who's already shown this whole town exactly how badly he panics under pressure. She stopped pacing. Looked at him. "It's enough, Garrett. It has to be enough. Because it's what we've got." Getting word to the judge fell unexpectedly to Etta Calloway. Not directly. No 7-year-old rides a message to a circuit judge. But Etta's mother ran the boarding house, and the boarding house was where the territorial deputy stayed whenever he passed through collecting reports for the judge's docket. And Etta, small and forgotten in the way children always were around adult business, had spent the whole winter listening at doors, without anyone thinking to stop her. "Deputy Ashford's leaving Thursday," she reported to Verity, swinging her legs from the porch step, utterly unaware of the weight of what she was carrying. "Mama said, he's got a satchel of papers going to the judge." "I heard her say it Thursday." Verity crouched down, bringing herself with visible effort to something closer to Etta's height. A habit Garrett had noticed her adopting more and more since the wedding, and one that never failed to catch at something soft in his chest. "Etta, I need you to do something important. Can you keep a secret till it's not a secret anymore?" Etta's eyes went wide and solemn, like the iron horses. Better than the iron horses. By Thursday afternoon, a sealed letter from Verity Holloway Vance, detailing the freight manifest, the wire transfer, the connection between Silas Pruitt's bank and Otis Kellerman's Boston lawsuit, sat inside Deputy Ashford's satchel alongside his routine reports, delivered there by a woman who ran the boarding house, and had, it turned out, never much cared for Silas Pruitt either. Now there was nothing to do but wait. And waiting, Verity was learning, all over again, was its own kind of suffering. Pruitt did not wait quietly. Word came within days that he'd begun moving faster on the foreclosure, pushing for an immediate sheriff's sale of the East parcel, trying to force the matter closed before any judge, early or otherwise, could arrive and ask questions he didn't want asked. Elias Thorne, meanwhile cornered and increasingly desperate, sent word that Kellerman intended to press for a default judgment in Boston if Verity failed to appear by a date that would require her to leave Montana within the week. A date, Verity understood immediately, timed precisely to keep her away from Silver Creek. When the sheriff's sale went through, "They're racing us," Garrett said, reading the notice by lamplight, his jaw tight, "trying to finish both before help arrives. Then we don't let them finish either." The sheriff's sale was set for the following Saturday, on the courthouse steps in the county seat, a half-day's ride from Silver Creek, and it was there, on a cold, bright morning with frost still silvering the grass, that Silver Creek's long winter of quiet cruelty finally broke open in front of the whole valley. The crowd that gathered on the courthouse steps was larger than the one that had watched Verity's stagecoach roll in months before. Word had traveled fast. Pruitt's bank, Garrett's land, the fire, Jonah, all of it stitched together, now into the kind of story a small town couldn't help but turn out for. Whatever its true motive for coming, Silas Pruitt stood near the auctioneer's stand, composed again, or trying to be. Though Verity could see the strain beneath it now, the brittleness of a man who knew the ground beneath him had already begun to crack. "We are gathered," the auctioneer began, "for the sale of the east parcel, property of Garrett Vance. Foreclosed upon by. I'd hold that sale, if I were you." The voice came from the road and every head turned as one. A rider approached at an easy trot, dust-coated, saddlebags heavy, and behind him a second rider in a dark coat that marked him, unmistakably, as territorial law, Deputy Ashford, and beside him, on a horse clearly unaccustomed to the pace he'd been keeping, rode a gray-haired man Verity had never seen before, but recognized instantly from the weary authority in his bearing. Judge Reuben Coulter had ridden 2 days ahead of his scheduled circuit. "Your Honor," Pruitt recovered fast, forcing warmth into his voice that didn't reach his eyes. "This is an unexpected. I imagine it is." The judge swung down off his horse, with the stiff care of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle for his liking, and fixed Pruitt with a look that had clearly ended careers before. "Got a letter 3 days back describing a wire transfer between your bank, Mr. Pruitt, and a Boston attorney currently residing, I'm told, at the local boarding house. Also got a freight manifest, courtesy of a mercantile owner, with apparently nothing better to do than read shipping records for pleasure." A faint, dry glance toward Higgins, who beamed like he'd been personally knighted, struck me as worth riding ahead to see for myself before this sale went forward. "Care to explain the connection, Mr. Pruitt? Or shall I ask Mr. Thorne to do it for you?" Elias Thorne, standing near the back of the crowd in his fine coat, went the color of old paper. "Your Honor, You'll get your turn, Counselor." Coulter didn't even look at him. "Mr. Pruitt, the connection." Pruitt's mouth opened. Closed. And for the second time in a month, Silver Creek watched the smooth, controlled banker find himself with absolutely nothing smooth left to offer. It was Verity who filled the silence, Your Honor. "If I may." She stepped forward, and the crowd parted for her the way it always did now. Not in shock, not anymore, but in something that had become, over these months, unmistakably deference. "My name is Verity Holloway Vance. I believe the letter you received was mine. You're the widow from the Boston matter, I am. And the man beside me is my husband, Garrett Vance, whose land Mr. Pruitt is attempting to seize this morning on the pretense of a railroad survey that does not, in fact, exist." She produced Higgins's territorial circular, unfolding it with the same steady hands that had once hauled granite for a living. "This is the actual published corridor. It runs nowhere near my husband's property. Mr. Pruitt invented the threat to justify calling in a note early, because the truth, Your Honor, is a good deal uglier than a railroad. Go on, Your Honor." "This valley already knows the truth of the fire," Verity said. 11 years back, a latch door, a boy named Jonah Pruitt, and a bargain his brother struck to bury it. My husband owns that story now, plainly, in front of anyone who cares to hear it. She turned toward Pruitt. "What this valley doesn't know yet, Your Honor, is what Mr. Pruitt did the moment keeping that secret stopped being enough for him. And when he finished, it was the judge himself who turned finally to the pale, cornered figure of Elias Thorne. And you, Counselor, care to tell me why a wire transfer from a Montana bank found its way into your client's Boston accounts 3 weeks before you ever boarded a westbound stage? Thorne's composure, already thin, finally gave out entirely. Mr. Kellerman and Mr. Pruitt have been business associates for some years, he said, voice cracking, investment partners. When Mr. Pruitt learned of railroad interest in this valley, he required capital quickly to move on nearby hospitals before word spread. Mr. Kellerman advanced funds in exchange for a share of the eventual profits. My instructions were to finalize the Holloway matter swiftly and quietly, so that Mrs. Vance would have neither the money nor the legal standing to interfere with. Anything else Mr. Pruitt might be arranging out here. You mean my husband's land, Verity said. Yes, say it plain, Mr. Thorne. Yes, his voice had gone very small. I was instructed to bury your claim, Mrs. Vance, specifically so you would not have resources to help your husband fight the foreclosure. It was a coordinated effort. Between the two men, a murmur rolled through the crowd, sharp with something between outrage and vindication. Judge Coulter let the silence sit a long moment before he spoke again. Sheriff Sale is suspended, pending full investigation of fraud and conspiracy on the part of Mr. Pruitt and his associates. His voice carried flat and final across the courthouse steps. Mr. Pruitt, you'll surrender the bank's books to territorial examiners by end of week. Mr. Thorne, I'd advise you find yourself separate counsel before this matter reaches a Boston courtroom, because I doubt Mr. Kellerman intends to protect you once his own conduct comes to light. He turned, finally, to Garrett and Verity, and something in his weathered face softened, just slightly. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, my apologies for the trouble it took to get here. Seems the two of you did most of the work before I ever arrived. We had help, Verity said, and glanced toward Higgins, who looked for one unguarded moment entirely overcome. The fraud investigation took the better part of a year. Pruitt's bank placed under territorial oversight. His ledgers combed line by line, until he was barred from banking in the territory for life, and until a Boston courtroom, 2,000 miles east, finally forced Otis Kellerman into a settlement that gave Verity, at long last, a fair accounting of 9 years' labor. But the part that mattered most to Garrett resolved faster than any of it. Jonah Pruitt, living under another name in Idaho, heard word of what had surfaced and did the one thing his brother's money had spent 11 years preventing. He wrote to Garrett directly. The letter was short, badly spelled in places, the handwriting of a man who'd clearly had little schooling and less practice with a pen. But it said plainly what needed saying, that he'd been 17 and drunk and furious, and had never, not for 1 second afterward, stopped seeing Garrett's ruined face in his mind every single night since. That he was sorry. That sorry didn't fix 11 years his own or Garrett's, but that he'd wanted, finally, to say it plain instead of letting his brother's money keep saying it for him. Garrett read that letter alone, out by the forge, and Verity found him there afterward, with the papers still in his hand, and something loose and unfamiliar moving behind his eyes. You don't have to forgive him, she said quietly, sitting down on the bench beside him. I know. He was quiet a long moment, watching the coals glow low in the banked forge. Don't know that I have, not all the way. But I've carried being angry at a boy who's been running from himself for 11 years. Same as I've been hiding from mirrors that same length of time, and I'm starting to think we've both paid enough on that debt. He folded the letter carefully. Maybe that's not forgiveness exactly. Maybe it's just being tired of carrying something so heavy for so long. That's allowed too, Verity said. Not every ending needs to be tidy to still be an ending. Spring came to Silver Creek slower than either of them expected, the way it always seemed to in high country. But it came the way it always does eventually. First the thaw at the creek's edge, then the green pushing up stubborn through last year's dead grass, then the gold, slanting light of a mountain evening that made even hard years feel, briefly, worth having lived through. The town had changed, in ways large and small. Dora Prentice's garden cuttings had become a standing Sunday visit. Higgins told the story of the freight manifest to anyone who'd stand still long enough to hear it, embellishing it a little further with each telling, until in his most recent version, he apparently single-handedly ridden down the judge himself. The ranch hands who'd once laughed outside the saloon now tipped their "Here, Verity" and meant it. And Etta Calloway, who had never once needed the town's long winter of slow-dawning decency to know what she already knew, had a whole shelf of iron horses now, lined up by size along her bedroom windowsill, each one a small permanent record of a friendship that had never required anybody's permission to begin. One evening, in late May, with the lilacs heavy on the air, and the light gone long and gold across the valley, Verity found Garrett standing in the doorway of the forge, looking out at the mountains the way he did most evenings now. Not bracing for anything anymore, she'd noticed. Just looking. "I have to tell you something," he said. "And I've been trying to find the words for about a week now, making a poor job of it every time." He turned to face her fully. Didn't angle the scarred side away. Hadn't in months now, though old habits sometimes still tugged at him in company. He didn't fully trust yet. "When I wrote that notice last fall, I'd made my peace with getting no answer at all. A man learns to want less, so the wanting doesn't kill him slow." His voice roughened. "And then you came down off at that stage, and the whole town gasped at your height instead of my face, and some ugly little part of me thought, good, now they'll leave me be and stare at her instead. Wasn't fair of me. Didn't even know I was thinking it till later, and I've been ashamed of it since, Garrett. Let me finish." He took a breath. "Because somewhere between then and now I stopped thinking of it as her staring and my staring, like we were two separate burdens sharing a house out of convenience. Somewhere in there you became the person I wanted to come home to. Not because you understood the scars. Because you never once treated them like the most interesting thing about me." Verity crossed the yard to him, and this time it was she who reached first, laying her palm flat against the ruined side of his face. The side no stranger had ever touched voluntarily in 11 years, and held it there, steady, until she felt him lean, just slightly, into her hand. "Garrett Vance," she said, "I have never once regretted stepping off that stage. Not on the worst day this winter. Not for one single minute." Her eyes had gone bright. "They told me a story before I ever left Boston. That a woman my size didn't get a real choice in these matters, that I ought to be grateful for whatever I could get. And they told you a story, too, that no woman would ever look past what the fire left behind. Every word of both stories was wrong. The only thing either of us ever got wrong was believing them for as long as we did." He bent his head, pressed his ruined cheek against her hair, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Just stood together in the doorway of the forge, the lilacs thick in the air, the valley quiet and gold around them. Two people who had spent most of their lives being looked at for all the wrong reasons. Finally, at long last, simply being seen for the right ones. In the years that followed, Silver Creek told the story often, and told it, as towns always do, a little differently each time, softening its own earlier cruelty with each retelling, until most who told it swore they'd welcomed the giant woman and the scarred blacksmith warmly from the very first day. Verity let them say it. She had learned by then that grace was mostly the art of allowing people to become better than they'd been, without demanding they first apologize for it in front of witnesses. The Holloway Granite Works settlement, once finalized, gave Verity the means to expand the smithy into a proper forge and foundry operation, the finest between Bozeman and the territorial line. And there were more than a few who noted, with a certain satisfaction, that Silas Pruitt's old bank building stood empty and unused not 200 yards from its door. Etta Calloway grew up, as children do, and married a rancher's son from the Larkspur spread, and at her wedding she wore, pinned carefully beneath her collar, where no one but she knew it was there, the very first small iron horse a scarred blacksmith had ever bent for a fearless little girl at his fence. She named her first daughter Verity. She never had to explain why. Everyone in Silver Creek already knew, and on summer evenings, for as long as anyone in that valley could remember afterward. You could find the blacksmith of Silver Creek and his wife sitting together on the porch of the house he'd once built for a bachelor's solitary life. His great scarred hand wrapped entirely around her, larger, stronger one. Both of them watching the light go long and gold across a valley that had once been so certain, so very certain, that neither of them deserved to be looked at with anything but pity. They had been right about exactly one thing. In the end, neither of them had ever been ordinary, and that, it turned out, had never once been the problem the town believed it was. It had only ever been the answer, waiting patiently for two people brave enough to finally believe it themselves.